Thanks to World Anvil for sponsoring this video.
Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to the world of D&D.
Or Dungeons and Dragons for short. At this point, everyone and their mother knows about or has even played D&D, including my mom. Actually, I just found out about that at Thanksgiving. Why wasn't I invited? Anyway, thanks to shows like Stranger Things, Dungeons & Dragons has become a household name in recent days. In fact, since the publication of the 5th edition of the Dungeons & Dragons rulebook, it has skyrocketed in popularity, and it's estimated that around 50 million people play D&D around the world. Just, not every week, because people get busy and have other scheduling conflicts. It's more like once every other month if we're lucky, but we've been on a bit of a hiatus. I digress. The point is, it's having a moment, and that moment has led to the seemingly outrageous and absurd use of this fantasy game in therapy. How can this nerd bait for basement dwellers, babies, and Satanists help someone with, real life problems? Well, I'll tell you because I've actually used D&D in therapy myself. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Dungeons & Dragons, well then, you have a very interesting way of choosing what videos to watch, but to catch you up, Dungeons & Dragons is actually a brand name for a kind of tabletop role-playing game. It's sort of like asking for a Kleenex when you need a tissue. A lot of people think that they mean the same thing because D&D is the most popular tabletop RPG and it's considered the originator of modern tabletop RPGs, but there are tons of others like Fate or Blades in the Dark or Call of Cthulhu or Shadowrun or Pathfinder or Starfinder or Star Trek RPG or Star Wars RPG and so on and so forth. But regardless of what TRPG you're playing, they all essentially have the same base elements. The way that I like to describe tabletop RPGs is like an improvised theatrical play. You and a few of your friends each play a character. Now, you come up with the character yourself, so you get to invent practically everything about this character, from their appearance to their backstory, to every intricacy of their psychology and how they operate in the world. And meanwhile, the director of the play acts as the narrator, and their job is to set the scene, paint word pictures, and breathe detail into the story that they want to tell. If there are other characters that are not played by you or your friends, well then the director plays those roles. So now that we have that settled, the director kicks off the play by setting up the environment and describing the start of the story. And you try to act and respond as your character while the director unfolds the world around you. Outside of some rules that help ground the world and keep things orderly, you're free to do whatever you want. And whatever you do will change whatever happens next. And that's what makes tabletop RPGs so fun. It's like a collaborative choose your own adventure book where you and your friends get to play the main characters and create an awesome story together. It's really not all that different from playing make-believe as a kid. You can slay fantastical monsters, go on epic quests, discover new planets in the cosmos, sneak into the seedy underbelly of a cyberpunk crime ring, or, start a small business farming pigs to financially support a hill giant whose family and friends you accidentally murder-hoboed. The only limitation is your imagination and the rules and whatever the DM says. But that's it. So what the hell does this have to do with therapy? I mean, after all, isn't D&D a satanic tool used to lure in unsuspecting youth to lead them down the path to occult practices and devil worship? Yes. At least that's what you would think if you were a parent in the 1980s.
Good evening. Tonight we begin with a story about make-believe adventure and real-life violence, and what some critics fear is a connection between the two in a game called Dungeons and Dragons.
Parents and psychiatrists are warning that the game is taking some children too far into the realm of dark and violent fantasy. They wonder whether for some children, Dungeons and Dragons becomes more than just a game.
Now, pardon me because I'm going to briefly veer off to explain the Satanic Panic because it's just wild that D&D got wrapped up in this, and if I don't talk about it, then that's all everybody's gonna talk about in the comments. Okay, so the short version is that leading up to the 80s, there was a sharp rise in media coverage about serial killers like Charles Manson or the Zodiac Killer or Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, to name a few. Turns out that stories about serial killers really get people to watch your show or buy your newspaper. So people thought that serial killers were everywhere, and it led to a lot of paranoia about anyone, even innocent children, being killed. Follow that up with the popularity of The Exorcist in the 70s, and suddenly people believed that demons were real, and they got real worried about that. And then we come to 1980, when the book Michelle Remembers is published. In the book, psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder writes about his real-life work with a woman named Michelle Smith, who was suffering from depression after a miscarriage. But rather than helping her, process the grief from her miscarriage, he instead was like, no, you're definitely depressed and sad because of some repressed childhood memories. So over 14 months and 600 hours of hypnosis, Michelle starts talking nonsense about how this satanic cult that her mother was a part of ritually abused her when she was 5 years old. They even summoned Satan himself, but don't worry. Jesus, Mary, and Michael the angel came and saved her. I'm not making this up. Anyway, because of this, parents got real convinced that preschools were actually a front for satanic rituals. This sounds kind of familiar. But unfortunately, this wasn't a joke. People who ran daycares were actually going to jail over this. So, with fear at an all-time high of killers, cults, devils, and child abuse, the stage was set for Dungeons & Dragons to become the fresh target of the Satanic Panic. In 1980, a 16-year-old student named James Dallas Egbert III went missing and was later found to have committed suicide. His parents hired a private investigator to uncover what happened, and though James had struggled for a long time with mental health issues and addiction, the investigator concluded that his death was the result of playing Dungeons & Dragons. Why? Well, the more religious types thought that D&D was a form of devil worship because there were all sorts of monsters, and they didn't like that people worshipped other gods or deities in it. So they thought that children were being mentally ensnared by Satan. And the narrative among the general public was that young people got so absorbed by the game that they became unable to discern fantasy from reality. And if they died in the game, then they'd kill themselves in real life too.
The goal here is to survive each adventure and gain points for killing enemy humans and monsters, and gather treasure along the way. But this medieval fantasy world is so detailed, so real, that some say it has caused kids to kill in the real world.
There's a lot more to it than just that, but you can see this exact sentiment reflected in Tom Hanks' first leading role, which was a made-for-TV movie called Mazes and Monsters.
What are you doing? Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't. It's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Maze control?
Yes. And I have absolute authority in this game.
Game?
Of course, it's all bullshit, and it turns out that devils aren't real, and this was just the obsessive ruminations of helicopter parents spurred on by sensationalist media. Actually, it's kind of funny because they were the ones who were having trouble discerning fantasy from reality. Dungeons & Dragons is just an entertaining game, like sports or video games. So coming back to my main point, that might be why it seems kind of strange that tabletop RPGs are being used in therapy, because, well, they're fun. And therapy is not fun. I'm being facetious, of course. Therapy is a never-ending joyride. No, the reason that this has caught on is because when you look at D&D and how it's played, you realize that the core components and skills needed to play the game have a huge overlap with the kinds of strategies that therapists might work on with clients to treat a wide array of mental health issues. And it's perfect for group therapy, which is why I ran a group myself. Yeah, I called it Dungeons and Dragons and Feelings. I did about 10 sessions starting at the beginning of 2020, but I never got to run it again because something happened. Something got in the way. But seriously, think about what you're doing when you play a TRPG. First off, it's a social game, so you're constantly practicing your social skills, which will promote things like teamwork and camaraderie. You learn how to build relationships with others and form a close bond.
The dragon has been slain, and you're free to rule your kingdom. Hey, this is really fun. You guys want to do this tomorrow night?
I have experienced this myself in a really big way. The first time that I ever played a tabletop RPG, it was January 30th, 2014, and me and 6 other people who I just met came to my apartment and we started playing Pathfinder together. We played every week for 5 years. And today, those folks are some of my best friends, and we still get together every week for our D&D time, even if we don't play anymore. So, seeing this community building component, it's no surprise that tabletop RPGs might help someone with social anxiety by building their social skills, or someone with depression who feels isolated and alone. Building off of that, because you're playing with a group of other people, it becomes immediately apparent how important effective communication is to the game. Whether that's sharing your thoughts and motivations as your character.
You're allowed to be a complex person.
She says, I love you so much. You're a good daughter.
Sorry, I thought you were gonna die.
Metagaming to figure out some complex situation with your teammates.
I attack Black Spider. This
No, wait.
Maybe there's a peaceful way to solve this.
Peaceful way to figure it out.
It's not peaceful. I'm gonna kill him.
Maybe gingerly talking your way out of an off-color joke that you made to a dragon about their mother. The game usually works best when people communicate clearly and respectfully, at least between each other. And when communication breaks down, well, that can be a really big problem, both in-game and in person.
What would you guys like to do?
We should cross the bridge and head for the Black Tower.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna head across the bridge, actually. I mean, what else is out there? What's south or east or west?
For God's sakes, Hank, it's been 5 seconds. Can you not do this?
Hey, you tell me.
But if you have a therapist in the room, then those communication problems can become a great way to learn and practice better interpersonal skills, such as assertive communication or emotion expression. On top of that, sort of the point of tabletop RPGs is to constantly throw challenges and obstacles at the players to see what they'll do, whether that's a puzzle or a conflict or some difficult decision. And that means that you, as the player, are regularly practicing problem-solving skills and tapping into your creativity to overcome whatever you encounter. The answer at the table is never, "Ugh, I can't. This is just too much. I give up. I suck." No. You try something, even if the odds are against you. So it's a really great way to develop this kind of flexible thinking that's necessary for learning how to, cope with difficult situations in real life.
Draconis, unfreeze time.
You guys can move again.
I breathe so much fire on
Hold it. You just used your move on freezing time. Kneel.
I take the sword of Duquesne, and I throw it at the amulet around the sad naked man's neck.
And I don't know about you, but when my creatively bad idea works, or if I crit on some last-ditch effort, I feel like a boss. I feel like I'm Ryan Lockwood clutching 112 on Streets in GoldenEye, which is another great benefit of role-playing games. It really gives you a sense of accomplishment and empowerment, and it makes you believe in your abilities. It's not hard to see how building resilience or self-esteem or confidence can all be broadly helpful in almost any problem that someone might want to resolve in therapy. Now, all of those sound wonderful and great, but if I'm being honest, I saved the best for last, because the primary reason that tabletop role-playing games integrate so well with therapy is because they utilize one of the most widely used techniques in the field: Role play. It's right there in the name. See, as far back as the 1920s, a therapy called psychodrama was developed, which is a type of treatment that uses role play and dramatization of real-life problems as a way for clients to better understand their experiences or life. So traditionally, this was used in a group setting, and what would happen is one person would talk about an issue that they're facing in their life and then act it out. And then the other members of the group would adopt roles of other people in the person's life, or they might even mimic what they saw the person do in order to give them insight into the conflict that they had or how they portray themselves. These days, psychodrama is a pretty uncommon group format, but role play as a tool has become extremely useful and widespread, especially in individual therapy. I use it a lot. I use it quite frequently with my clients for a number of different reasons. Sometimes I use it to help people practice having difficult conversations. Like if a client wants to tell their parent that they failed all their classes, I might say, okay, imagine that I'm your mom. I want you to tell me what you would say to her, and I'll try to react. Sometimes I'll use it to have a client pretend to be someone else in order to build empathy. For example, I might have a client pretend that they're now their roommate who they're fighting with over the trash to just get that perspective shift. Sometimes I'll use it to help someone through common interview questions because they've got an interview coming up and they're feeling really nervous about it. Or I might use it as a component of exposure therapy to help people process trauma or reduce phobias. The reason that role play is such an effective tool is because it allows clients to practice new behaviors, emotions, or perspectives in a safe and controlled environment. And since there's no actual consequences, it gives clients the opportunity to feel more comfortable and less anxious for the real thing later on. So yeah, now let's look at Dungeons and Dragons. It's mostly role-playing, which can offer so many opportunities in a clinical setting. If a therapist understands the struggles of each client in their group, they can essentially tailor the story to incorporate those obstacles in the session in order to give clients the opportunity to overcome them. And on top of that, by playing a character that they create, clients have full control to express themselves. And as you can imagine, tabletop RPGs can become a powerful tool for exploring and experimenting with different identities, especially for members of the LGBTQ+ community. Players can create characters that are very different from themselves in personality, or background, or gender identity, or gender expression, or sexual orientation. And doing it in the context of the game lets people safely try on this different identity that they may or may not be able to express in their everyday life. It's really a great way to understand and challenge those social norms or roles that we get typecast into. And by playing as someone else, we can also cultivate a greater sense of empathy for people who are different from ourselves.
How do you begin your adventure?
We're the club at Isildur, yeah?
Tyrell, this is highly unusual. I think the guys probably just want to go on the quest that we've already...
Steven?
Yes?
I'd like to join Kanye the Giant in his quest.
So as you can see, there are a lot of potential benefits in the therapy context, and that's why I was so excited to play my own D&D therapy group. But I was not the first, far from it. In fact, I even got the idea from my brother Ian, who's a social worker who nowadays manages a violence prevention program. But back in 2019, he ran a D&D peer support group for high schoolers. So I decided to give him a call. Yo, how's it going? Good, how are you? Good. So I got the idea to run a D&D group from you because you did it first. Tell me about your group, I guess, first off. Just tell me what you did.
So the program that I worked for was called Families Forward Wraparound. And we worked with kids who are at risk of being removed from their homes because of abuse or neglect or just some really challenging parts of the family dynamic. And all of our clients, they're all kids, but they had mental health diagnoses.
Right.
And so managing their mental health was even more challenging in that kind of environment. The Dungeons and Dragons group that we used was a way for them to practice some of those skills in a controlled way, in a safe way, and then they can use that as a way to practice skills and then apply them in real life. So, for example, we had kids who would respond to stress by being aggressive, right? And that obviously got them in trouble at school, got them in trouble at home and in the community. And so we were able to use D&D as a way to create stressful environments and then help them work through those in a non-violent or a non-aggressive way. When you're playing, it's fun, it's goofy, it's creative. Like, they're not really aware that they're practicing skills, and that's kind of a good thing.
Right.
But then afterward, we'd have a conversation and say, all right, let's talk through what happened, what worked, what didn't work, and we'd help them connect those dots of, here's what you were doing that worked really well.
Yeah.
And let's apply that in real life. You know, I know you had a stressful situation you dealt with 2 weeks ago. At home, what if we used what you did today when that comes up again?
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
And it wasn't just, you know, preventing clients from being aggressive, but it was helping them, you know, learn independent living skills. How do you manage a budget? How do you use public transportation?
Yeah.
How do you start a conversation with someone you've never met before?
Right.
Or how do you manage conflict with a friend?
Right.
Or a stranger? You know, things like that. So it's really easy to create that environment for them to practice it in real time. So
totally. Yeah. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the early adopters of TRPGs in therapy were mental health professionals working with children, particularly kids who had behavioral issues or ADHD or who were on the autism spectrum. And that makes sense because tabletop RPGs mesh perfectly with another quite popular form of therapy, which is play therapy. See, most children in general feel more comfortable expressing themselves through play rather than through talk therapy. Not to mention, it's more interactive and engaging, which is great for keeping the attention of kids. And as I just talked about, tabletop RPGs can be a really exciting way to work on relevant abilities for those kids. But it's not only good for kids. It turns out that play is good for adults, too. Now, my D&D therapy group specifically targeted people with social anxiety and self-esteem issues, but initial research shows that tabletop RPGs can help people feel more socially connected. It can also increase self-awareness and independence in individuals with intense personality disorders. And it's even been used on US veterans to help reduce symptoms of PTSD. Now, I would personally assert that I think that tabletop RPGs could be an effective add-on for many other conditions, including depression, generalized anxiety, phobias, borderline personality disorder, addiction, schizophrenia, OCD, you name it, so many others. But it's worth saying that just because I'm expounding on the benefits of tabletop RPGs doesn't mean that it's for everyone. Some people might really struggle with the social aspect of the game, and others might really not enjoy the imaginative nature of role-playing. Also, if someone has a hard time with memory or attention, or if their symptoms are too intense, such as someone with really severe depression or schizophrenia, then it's not ideal. And some people just, don't like playing games. These are all legitimate reasons not to use tabletop RPGs in therapy. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that even though I think that this could be widely applicable to many mental health scenarios, that's just my opinion at this point, since the use of tabletop RPGs in therapy is a really new technique. It means that there isn't really the research to show how effective it is with various issues. And the studies that have been conducted all have different ways of making the game therapeutic. There's no one manual or training about how to conduct a therapeutic D&D session. Yet. I say yet because I recently came across the work of Dr. Megan Connell. She's a self-described geek psychologist who provides online therapy, and she recently wrote a book called Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy, a guide for the clinician game master. It's set to release at the end of March, and as far as I can tell, it's the first book of its kind. So I got in touch with her and had a chance to ask a few questions.
So I am Dr. Megan Connell. I am a licensed psychologist. I was active duty military psychologist, and then after getting out of the military, went into private practice. And then in my private practice, I started using Dungeons and Dragons as a therapy tool. And it's been something that I've been really passionate about, and I've helped to develop a training program. And then I've recently written the book, Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy, the guide for the clinician GM.
When I was researching, I had a really hard time finding an abundance of research about using TRPGs in therapy. Everyone does it a little bit different. And so there's not a ton of really convincing evidence at this point.
Well, so, okay, anybody reading my book, you can play a drinking game called Take a Shot Every Time I Write Not Enough Research. There isn't enough research. So real quick, I have a theory as to why that is.
Okay.
And I think it's the Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
Because there is actually not a ton of studies, but some pretty decent starter studies from the early 1980s.
Really?
This one from, I think it's Zays and Lewis.
Yeah.
It was a pilot program they were running at a youth center in New York for I think it was more like at-risk youth. But they noticed like the groups that were playing D&D were learning better social skills, communication skills. They were like more engaged. And so they actually like ran a little pilot where they compared some kids who are in the D&D groups to kids who weren't. Mm-hmm. And they found the kids who were learning conflict resolution. They talked about the importance of having a diverse group of friends. And like they concluded, they're like, this needs to be studied. This could actually be used in therapy, right? And so the goal of using D&D is to teach your players skills that aren't necessarily related to the game.
Mm-hmm.
They can be used in the game, they can be helpful in the game, but they aren't the goal. Mm-hmm. Like getting better at playing D&D is not the goal.
Right.
It's not about telling the story, it's about giving the opportunities for growth.
Right.
Whereas in a traditional game, it's about telling the story. It's interesting though, because for the most part, if you were to be a fly on the wall at a therapeutic game, it doesn't necessarily look any different than a game at a game store.
Right.
The biggest difference is we might have moments where we're reminding people of skills that they learned at the start of the session. We might put down the DM screen for a little bit and process some stuff that's going on. We might talk about trauma. We might talk about emotional growth. Mm-hmm. But like really, for the most part, we're talking in silly voices and telling silly stories and slaying dragons.
Mm-hmm. It really seems like the future of this technique is bright. I mean, research will eventually catch up, right? And I think that we will eventually see more and more use of TRPGs in treatment. There's already companies springing up that focus on this area. For example, there's the nonprofit Game to Grow that trains mental health professionals and designs games for use in therapy, including their TRPG Critical Core, which has been used in counseling programs and hospitals and schools. Now, I've been talking a lot about how TRPGs can be helpful, but you might wonder what a session even looks like. Like, what are you doing the whole time? Well, I ran a session with some other creator friends, and I sprinkled in some base therapeutic elements.
You immediately hear a scream come from somewhere outside.
Oh man, coffee or screams? This is a moral quandary.
I think it was more unwell person in here, person in trouble outside.
Let's go check outside.
So we should split the party, and Orwin should go first outside.
Me? But as you exit the tavern door, you see an unconscious man lying motionless on the ground. And above him are 4 dark hooded forms floating over him.
So if you want to watch that, the whole session, I uploaded it on Nebula, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But to give you an idea, you typically start session with a check-in. Every participant talks about what's been on their mind, or the therapist might give them a prompt, and then gameplay starts. As my brother Ian said,
it has to start with the fun.
You don't want to make it too obvious that you're doing therapy because it doesn't feel organic. But as the game master, you would weave in conflicts or bring up communication problems as a way of working on those things.
Wait, you're gonna leave me?
Because where we're going is dangerous.
But I thought I came to be on an adventure.
This is an important job.
That's true. Okay.
And don't forget about your son, Abacuso.
Yeah. Abacuso died too, but...
Wait, what do you mean too?
You know, died with his mother.
Oh.
And then, at the end of session, you have a debrief and talk about what the clients worked on and what progress they made so that you can connect the dots between the game and their real lives.
At least one thing that your character learned and one thing that you feel that you learned from this adventure.
Weirdly enough, with the troll encounter, Grelke didn't realize how wrong that was and how bad it felt. So he tried and luckily succeeded in like trying to retcon that group decision that he felt he was a part of.
I had such a fun time developing this one-shot campaign, and I did a lot of it on stream with many of you who gave me a lot of excellent advice and suggestions. I'm not a super experienced DM, so it was a process to develop the game from scratch, but I feel like I was able to bring my campaign to life using World Anvil. World Anvil is the ultimate tool for any game master or player. I mean, have you ever tried to make a wiki for your game? Yeah, it's kind of limited in its functionality and it gets messy fast. I made one many years back and yeah, I stopped using it after a few sessions. But World Anvil is like the opposite of that. It has everything I needed to make a rich one-shot, including character bios, timelines, and stat blocks. You can essentially make it your one-stop shop to house everything that you need to play your game. And you can really make it look incredible. I felt so proud of myself for making my little one-shot, but oh my God, some people create beautiful homepages for their campaigns, or they even design interactive maps to track everything happening in the world, or even in the universe. They support over 45 different systems, including D&D 5e, and they even have 25 different world-building article templates that really make the process easy. But it's also completely customizable to the point that you can tailor it to your own system, even if it's homebrewed. And if you're a player, you can have your character sheet, journal, inventory, and spellbook all in one place. You can even roll dice by clicking on your stats. I feel like it sounds like I'm being overly effusive about World Anvil, but it really is an amazing site. And can I just say, the World Anvil community is just really sweet. The site was created by a husband and wife couple who are so passionate about helping people play the game. And they have a super active Discord server where people can get help, or share suggestions, or share ideas, or connect with other tabletop RPG players. I really can't recommend it enough. So, if you want to create, or store, or organize your own campaign, then check out World Anvil for free. They already give you a lot of functionality right off the bat, and if you want to get a great deal on their annual plans, well then check out the description for an exclusive discount. Using our discount obviously really helps the channel a lot, but I'm actually more excited to hear about how you're using it and what your thoughts are on it. I think it's a really just powerful tool. Anyway, check that out down below. Thanks. I appreciate you giving me your attention for so long. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with tabletop RPGs, whether that be sharing, your favorite character that you created, or a story that you think is really funny, or how you think you've personally benefited from tabletop RPGs. I'll be replying down in the comments, so I'll see you there. And until next time, I'm Micah. Well met.